Okay, Brady. So today we're going to talk about heat training, and we're going to focus on a very specific type of heat training, which I've seen around more recently. There's a new research paper on it, and it's something that you've been implementing in a form for quite a while. And it's basically post-run full body immersion in hot water, right? And what we're saying here is that this form of heat training acts almost as a proxy for altitude training. Is that kind of what I've picked up from this paper?
Yes, exactly. And they kind of refer to this as a cross-adaptation. So it's this idea that you're using the heat as a stimulus, but it is mimicking some of the effects of altitude training. And I think what's fun about it, and we'll get into this, is that it's not necessarily heat training in the strictest sense, because the exercise that the runners were performing, or the cyclists rather, that were performing in this study, it wasn't done in the heat. It was just done in normal temperatures, and they got in the bath afterwards. So it's like this interesting stimulus that wasn't necessarily a traditional heat training, but this unique hot water bath stimulus that was producing some of the adaptations that looked like those of training in altitude. So I think we're going to talk a lot about today, how runners can implement this without going to altitude. Most of us don't have access to that. So I think this will be a fun study to discuss.
I think that's one of the interesting things here is altitude training is well known, the benefits are well known, but it's just impractical for most of us. And what the study is saying is you can get some measure of the benefits in a bath, which most of us have. So why don't we start? What do we actually know about altitude training? And why is it a big deal if we can mimic some of those adaptations without actually having to travel to altitude?
Altitude training, it's probably one of the, original performance enhancing methods that endurance athletes, runners, cyclists have always used. I think everyone will know of the kind of the live high, train low, or even train high, race low kind of strategy. Basically, athletes will go to an altitude training camp. Say, if you're in America, people will travel to Flagstaff, Arizona, somewhere out in Colorado, where altitude's, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 feet. And that means, up there at altitude, the partial pressure of oxygen is lower. Essentially, just what that means is you're going to get less oxygen into your blood at high altitude. So when you train there, a few things happen. You don't even have to train there, just when you go to altitude and live there for a few weeks. But when you go up to altitude, a few things happen. The main thing is your body increases its production of something called erythropoietin, or EPO, and that basically stimulates our body to make more red blood cells, which contain a protein called hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is basically what oxygen binds to in the body, helps our blood transport oxygen throughout the body. So hemoglobin increases, one of the key adaptations to altitude training. That basically means our body can carry more oxygen, and therefore we're going to increase our performance, our endurance exercise performance. EPO, it increases within 24 to 48 hours after you go to altitude. Day 5 through 7, we start producing, more red blood cells. And then after 3 to 4 weeks, you've kind of like maxed out the EPO production. But it's kind of crazy how quickly it happens. Within 24 hours, your EPO starts to increases more red blood cells. EPO is also something that, you can take illegally. Cyclists infamously blood dope with EPO, and that basically forces your body to produce more red blood cells, and you don't have to go to altitude to do that. Something else that happens, a few other things that happen, your plasma volume increases. So plasma is just the water portion of your blood. That increases as well. So basically you just have a greater blood volume, but you also have more hemoglobin, which is that key protein that will carry oxygen. In addition to what happens to your blood, a few other things happen. So, without getting too deep into it, you increase the number of capillaries in your muscles. Capillaries are also critical for oxygen transport. They're just those tiny little blood vessels. Mitochondrial density, mitochondrial content also increase, as do your aerobic energy producing enzymes. So essentially, a lot of the adaptations that happen with endurance training are either mimicked or enhanced with altitude training. And it's because, Thomas, if you just think about it, you're putting your body into this low oxygen state at altitude. and it's forced to adapt. So you stay there for several weeks and your body says, oh, okay, well, we need to normalize our oxygen levels. So we're going to have all these adaptations going on that will bring our body's oxygen levels back up to normal. And traditionally, when athletes altitude train, they don't sometimes actually train at altitude. A lot of times it's this live high, train low. So they will say, sleep at 10,000 feet and then go down for their training session at maybe 2,000 to 3,000 feet or something, or even sea level. The reason for that is because, as you can imagine, if you travel up to 10,000 feet and you're not accustomed to it, training is going to be harder. Your training quality is going to be compromised. You can't automatically just go to altitude and say start running intervals at your marathon race pace. And so you sleep high, you get those adaptations, and then you come down to sea level to complete your training sessions, and then you go up and live and sleep at the altitude. So you're kind of getting those kind of dual benefits. A lot of athletes also will sleep in altitude tents for that reason, or simulated altitude chambers and things like that. So that's kind of a brief overview of some of the adaptations that happen with altitude.
Yeah, I was in a call recently with somebody who had been to an altitude training camp in China, where basically every Chinese Olympian lived, regardless of their pursuit. And it was live high, train low. So the whole idea being you get adaptations just by living in altitude, but then they would go down the mountain to do their training. And, this brings up a couple of good questions. You mentioned altitude tents, which seem legit, I'm guessing. So these are big. I think they cost like $5,000 or $6,000, right? And you basically put it over your bed and you sleep in a reduced oxygen state. So is that accurate, and are they effective?
Yeah, I mean, they work. Granted, I've never personally used one, but they are legit. If you have the money to spend on one of those, and your significant other, is okay with also putting that over the bed and maybe wants to altitude train with you. Yeah, I mean, they're legit. They simulate altitude perfectly. It's just reducing the amount of oxygen in the air that you're breathing. So yeah, they're pretty much going to mimic going up to high altitude, which is why a lot of athletes will use them. And sometimes, you could kind of combine strategies. So maybe go to a medium altitude and then also maybe sleep in altitude tent. I think that's something that athletes do as well. So lots of strategies for there. But yeah, altitude tents, those are legit.
And then I saw these 5 or 10 years ago, hypoxic rooms in gyms where it's like a small room in a gym where they've got a dial where they can adjust the oxygen content and, again, simulate altitude. But this is for training for shorter periods of time. So based on what you've told me already, it sounds like these are less effective for actually getting the benefits of altitude training.
Maybe less effective. I think the benefit there would be that you could actually sort of train in that lower oxygen environment, as opposed to an altitude tent where, unless it was really big, you probably couldn't fit like a stationary bike or a treadmill in there. I've actually never heard of these altitude rooms in gyms, but that's kind of interesting. So I'd like to see if there are any of those around me. But yeah, I think it would be legit. But again, you might just have to be careful in maybe dialing back, not simulating, say, like 10,000 feet, but maybe, a percent of oxygen, like 18% or something, which is just a little bit lower than normal. Interesting concept, but one I'm not too familiar with. So it seems like it would be legit, but also could compromise training intensity, kind of as we just mentioned.
Yeah, I'm gonna Google it. Maybe it was a thing from 5 or 10 years ago. There was a marathon in Kashmir in North India that I signed up for, and I used to live in Mumbai in India, and I was getting a bit nervous about, I can't remember the altitude of Kashmir, but it's regarded as a place you need to go for 3 or 4 days just to adjust so you don't get altitude sickness when you arrive. So I was kind of thinking I could train in this room, but never ended up going. So I don't know if there's still a thing, but once we finish here, I'm going to check it out. Okay.
Maybe that's my next business model. I need to start a gym here in Austin, Texas that's a hypoxic gym or something like that.
Hypox. There you go.
Hypox. Cool. We could create a new sport. High rocks, but low oxygen.
Low oxygen. Okay, so altitude training, very well recognized as being, a bit of a major performance booster. Just impractical for most of us, because who can either afford or go to the trouble of getting a tent, or even, more, move your life to live at altitude. So we're looking for ways we can potentially get similar adaptations while just using what we have in our immediate environments. And that is where heat training comes in this specific form of heat training. And okay, let's go to heat training first. Why don't you tell us what we know about heat training and why it's useful?
Yeah, heat training. It's useful if you are preparing for a race in the heat. Obviously, you can work to lower your core temperature during exercising in the heat, improve your sweating rate. So you're going to sweat earlier and sweat more. Sweating is an adaptive cooling mechanism. So kind of contrary to what people might think, somebody who sweats a lot is actually not out of shape or unheat adapted. They're actually pretty well heat adapted. I was trying to convince my wife of this the other day. She was like, "Why are you just sweating, like sitting there?" I'm like, "Well, I'm very heat adapted." And I'm like, "You don't sweat." But so I was trying to convince her, and she said that it was because she was in better shape than me. That's why she didn't sweat. I digress. So yeah, in terms of, athletes, if you want to train in the heat to perform better in the heat, that's pretty well known, and it kind of makes sense. But one of the things about heat adaptation and sort of using either active or passive heat, which passive heat is actually what we're going to talk about today, is that you don't necessarily have to exercise in it to get some of these adaptations. And so when I refer to passive heat adaptation, I'm talking about things like, say, a hot bath or a sauna, or maybe it's just hot outside and you're just like going to sit outside. So exercising in the heat obviously is going to challenge the body more so than this passive heat exposure. But either way, what does the heat stimulus do, whether it's added to exercise or just being passive? So heat stress, obviously your body's core temperature is going to increase. You're going to start sweating. You're going to get an activation of these things called heat shock proteins, or HSPs, which are basically these signaling molecules in the body that cause a wide range of effects. They kind of stabilize proteins. They're kind of these stress response proteins that, when they're increased, they just make the body more resilient over time. And heat shock protein increases are one of the key things that happens when you, say, get into a sauna or start exercising in the heat. You also will get, both in the short term and a long term, blood vessel and cardiac adaptations. So just like the altitude, your plasma volume will increase if you're doing heat training and heat adaptation. You're going to lose it in the short term during the heat. You're going to sweat. You're going to be dehydrated. But actually that dehydration is then going to be a stimulus to increase your plasma volume in the long term. Your blood volume, your hemoglobin also increase again, because essentially, like at altitude, you're challenging your body's ability to deliver oxygen, because heat is a stress. And when you're dehydrated, your body just doesn't have a lot of blood to circulate to cool you off and to get oxygen to your working muscles in. That's going to cause a lot of those similar adaptations. But some of the classic adaptations that are different, again, as I mentioned, you're going to start sweating earlier. Your core body temperature during exercise or just during the heat exposure will eventually then be lower. So compared to, the same heat stimulus before versus after, you're going to have a lower core body temperature. So like altitude, where you're forcing your body to adjust to low oxygen, with heat, you're forcing your body to have all these mechanisms that come into place to help your body cool itself more efficiently, to prepare more adequately for this next heat stressor. So there's a lot of overlap between heat and altitude, which is interesting. The increase in another kind of protein called hypoxia inducible factor 1, HIF1, is also increased. You get the blood plasma volume adaptations. Those are kind of the primary two ones that will increase there. Also, your heart increases its stroke volume; it becomes stronger, particularly then also due to that increase in your plasma volume. Your heart rate decreases. So a lot of similar adaptations, which is pretty interesting, and then kind of gets into this idea of cross-adaptation, which this study that we're going to talk about soon explores.
Okay, so let's get to the study. It was released last month, and it looks at the benefits of adding on, after your bout of exercise, post-exercise hot water immersion, which essentially is they had their participants have a long hot bath after doing some rigorous workout, and then they compared the results to the control group. So what did they find?
Yep. So I think maybe I'll back up just a little bit and go over the
Sure.
protocol, because I think that's kind of interesting to chat about. So what they did was, there were two groups, control group, then the hot water immersion group. So both of the groups trained. So they did 3 high intensity interval sessions every single week. It was the Norwegian 4x4 protocol. So 40% or 4 minutes, at 90% of VO2 max, and then 4 minutes of recovery. Repeat that 4 times. They did that 3 times per week, which, actually is like a pretty intense training regimen. They did that for 6 weeks, and these were kind of like recreationally active folk. So both groups completed the training program. One of them was the control group, so they didn't take a bath, after exercise. And then one of them was the hot water immersion group. So they did a 40-minute bath. They actually went from 40 and they progressed to 60 minutes in that hot bath by the end of the study. So every couple of weeks, they increased it by 10 minutes. They took hot water bath after exercise, and that was at 42 Celsius, which is 107 degrees Fahrenheit. And so this was one of the things when I posted about this study, a lot of people were commenting about. It's very hot and for a very long time. Most hot tubs, at least in the United States, don't go to 107. They're like 104, I think, is the kind of the hottest allowable temperature. And sitting in there for 40 to 60 minutes is a long, long time. That's really hard for a lot of people to do. And they did this 5 times per week. So they did it after every exercise session, but then they also did it twice more per week on non-exercise days. So 5 heat exposure sessions every single week for 40 to 60 minutes at that 42C, 107 degree Fahrenheit. And so I think, again, we'll get into the results soon, but I think one of the important thing to note is, that's a very stressful stimulus. It's hard, and it's probably not possible, maybe even or feasible for a lot of people to do that. And everybody should be safe if they're, wanting to do that heat stress. But I think that's kind of the point, right? We're mimicking, I think it was, they were mimicking, 8 or 9,000 feet of altitude, they said. So it was like to mimic a stimulus like altitude, you need another hard stimulus. It's not just like you can hop in a warm tub for 10 minutes and, oh my gosh, it's similar to altitude training. No, you need to really stress the body if we're going to try to mimic these adaptations to altitude. So yes, it was hard. Yes, it might not have perfect kind of ecological validity. Like most people might not be able to do it for that long, that many times per week and that hot. But to get the adaptations to altitude without altitude, maybe that's what you have to do. You could do a few times less per week, but we'll talk about the applications maybe afterward. So that was the study protocol. And so what did they find? I think a few kind of the main things to go over, like what they found, and then maybe just as important is like what they didn't find or what wasn't different between the two groups. So I think the main thing, people are always interested in performance. So their performance did improve, but interestingly, not much happened at normoxia, so normal oxygen levels. So most of the performance tests they did after this protocol, they did a VO2 max test. They did a time to exhaustion test. So basically, how long can you ride a bike for at 70% or 80% of your VO2 max? And then they did just 2 steady state exercise sessions at 40% and 60% of their VO2 max. Both of those were done in hypoxia, so low oxygen conditions, 13% oxygen, so say mimicking altitude, and then normoxia, so sea level. They did all of those performance tests in 2 different conditions. For the performance, time to exhaustion, they improved it, but only under the hypoxic condition. So the hot water bath group improved by about 35%, or about 3 minutes, I think, in their time to exhaustion test. The control group improved by about 1.5 minutes, so 25%. So both groups improved, obviously. They were engaging in high intensity interval training. Their performance is going to improve. But they only improved it under the hypoxic conditions. Their actual time to exhaustion tests under normoxic conditions, they weren't different. So they improved, but the hot water baths didn't produce a greater improvement than the not hot water baths, I guess you could say. So peers, that was the main benefit there. Oh, it improves your performance at quote unquote altitude, but it might not improve it better than just regular old training under sea level conditions. Their VO2 max, again, improved after both training regimens, but wasn't different between the hot water immersion group and the normal group. So no difference there for VO2 max. And then the steady state exercise, they did, at 40% and 60%. So kind of this zone 2, like low intensity, and normoxia and hypoxia were generally similar. There were a few differences though. And one of the main ones was at the 60% intensity and during the time to exhaustion test, again, under hypoxia, and in some cases in the normal or like the sea level conditions, their respiratory efficiency was better. So what this means was that their tidal volume, basically how much air they got in every time they took a breath, that increased. They had better oxygen saturation. So basically their breathing was more efficient during exercise, which I think is a pretty, important improvement, because that basically just means if your respiratory muscles are more efficient, you're going to use less oxygen during exercise. And that means you can put more energy towards, actually running versus, breathing. Your breathing is using less energy. So they had improved respiratory efficiency after the hot water baths, which was one more of the beneficial adaptations that was different between those two groups. Another thing that was different, at rest, they had lower resting heart rates, they had a lower core body temperature, and during exercise as well, their heart rates tended to be a little bit lower. Their core body temperature, especially during, exercise and those in hypoxia, tended to be lower as well. So kind of the classic signs of heat adaptation, that's what you would expect. And then the last benefit, one of the ones that was, I think, the novel finding here was that the hot water baths increased their hemoglobin concentrations compared to the group who didn't take hot water baths. So, as we discussed before, one of the classic adaptations to altitude training is an increase in hemoglobin concentration, the protein that carries oxygen throughout your body. That was greater in the normal group compared to the hot water bath group compared to the regular group. It improved by about between 5 and 6% after the hot water immersion, and then about 2% in the normal group. So it's kind of a general overview. I think the key takeaways, if people are really interested in what kind of matters and what does hot water immersion help with compared to just say regular training, hemoglobin, definitely one of the big ones. Better performance at altitude or in low oxygen conditions, and then the improved respiratory efficiency at not your maximal output, but your lower intensity. So your 40%, your 60% of your VO2 max, better respiratory efficiency. Those were kind of the three key findings, I think, that are worth highlighting in this study. But just as important, are what wasn't different, which again, I highlighted some of the things like VO2 max, and then a lot of the differences at sea level were not different, indicating that, one of the main benefits of this heat exposure could be better performance at altitude, and for athletes who might want that altitude stimulus or training for a race at altitude who don't have the means to actually train at altitude, that could kind of be a suitable alternative.
And what do you think of the importance of having these hot baths or hot water immersion post-exercise versus just doing it on an off day or doing it, later in the day?
Yeah, that's a great point. I think doing it post-exercise is going to have several advantages to say just doing it alone, because if you time it very close to the end of your exercise session, which they did in this study, and which I think is an important component of that, you're going to have an elevated core body temperature going in to that hot water session. You're probably going to be a little bit dehydrated. You're going to have just this hormonal milieu of post-exercise things that are upregulated after exercise going into that hot bath. So you're basically just going to get this compounding effect, of adding that hot bath onto everything else that you've just done during the exercise session.
A lot of the stressors that you introduce during your exercise, you're just prolonging them. You're just keeping them going while not being physically active. Actually, one question: what's the research on this hot bath in terms of recovery? So if I do a hard run and then jump in the hot bath, is it okay? So I'm getting these benefits, but is it also slowing down my recovery?
I think I would say yes in this case, because the hot bath is an additional stressor rather than sort of a recovery intervention. And I think that's a key point here, is that Hot baths, they're beneficial, but you have to think of them as a training stress. I mean, an hour in a hot bath, even if it's not as hot as the bath that they used in this study, your heart rate's going to be high. You're going to be sweating. You're going to be dehydrated. Your stress hormones are going to increase. And so, yes, that's part of the adaptations that are going to, or the part of the stimulus that's going to lead to the adaptations. But you have to note that that's definitely a training stress. So if you go for a hour run and then take an hour hot bath, that's a 2-hour training session. That's not just like, oh, I did an hour run and this hot bath's going to help with my recovery. I would say a protocol like this, not going to probably help much with your, I guess, your like autonomic nervous system recovery. It might help muscular recovery because hot water does actually promote recovery pretty well, but perhaps not hot water that's this high. So I think if you are going to use a hot bath for recovery purposes, lower duration, less heat, that's definitely going to promote kind of blood flow, promote this recovery process. But this protocol, I would think of this as this is an extra training session.
Yeah. It's part of your session. Cool. Is there anything in the study that we've missed, or should we move on to talking about how to implement this and different options for thinking about this type of heat training?
I think it would be good to move on to the applications. We've kind of covered everything, I think, from the study that's key to take away some of the key adaptations, the protocol. So yeah, why don't we go into talking about how people can apply this stuff?
Okay, well, first off, so you actually wrote a Substack post based on this journal, and at the end, you've got some specific recommendations for implementing hot baths. So why don't we go through those first? You've got here, after your hard sessions, ideally 3 or more times per week, immerse yourself in hot water. And again, it's 42 degrees Celsius or 107 Fahrenheit, which is pretty hot, up to chest level for 40 to 50 minutes. Is that right?
Yeah, that was the protocol that they used in this study. So those tips that I provided were basically to replicate the protocol from this study. I think, though, that, okay, let's just say, people aren't willing or able to do the stimulus or replicate the stimulus from this study, which I think is totally fine. I think doing a hot bath after maybe 2 or 3 of your training sessions every single week, maybe keeping it 20 to 30 minutes and maybe it being at a lower temperature, 100 to 104 degrees Fahrenheit, which, forgive me, I can't do the conversion to Celsius in my head right now, but slightly lower temperature than that used in the study. I think that will obviously replicate the same adaptations. They just might not be at the same magnitude of those that were observed in this study. So yeah, you're going to get increased hemoglobin. You might get, better respiratory efficiency. You're going to get the increase in, your plasma volume. You can do it. So just maybe, cut this protocol in half, use a little bit lower of a temperature, and you can still get a lot of those adaptations. So I don't think, most people can or should maybe replicate the exact protocol used in this study. This was a very well controlled, very well monitored, scientific study that used this protocol. But if people actually want to kind of implement this, you could kind of do something slightly less intense.
Okay, now tell me, so you've been doing a form of this type of post-exercise heat training for quite a while in the sauna, right? So tell me how you do it, and tell me if there's any big considerations to take into account if somebody's considering using the sauna versus what they did in the study.
Yeah, the sauna, interestingly, so when I was in the lead up to when I was training for the Boston Marathon, I actually utilized hot baths a few times per week, which was something new. And that was basically just because I wasn't getting to the gym where my sauna is as often as I would have liked. And so I decided to, how can I replicate this at home? So I 1 to 2 times per week after my runs, I was doing a hot bath for like 20 to 30 minutes. And it was funny. It was the first time I had ever used it. And I was very surprised because initially I was skeptical because I'm a huge fan of the sauna, the traditional like Finnish sauna. I was skeptical of, how much a hot bath could actually cause me to, say, sweat and cause some of these, what I at least appeared to be beneficial adaptations. But what's unique about the bath compared to a sauna is that you're in contact with the water. So it rapidly heats you up because your body is sucking up that heat from the water because you're in direct contact with it. As opposed to a sauna, it's hot and the air is heating you up and it takes a little bit longer. But the hot bath, I was getting in there and sweating for, pretty profusely for 15 to 20 minutes. Basically how I would use that, to basically finish my run, fill up the bath, hop in 20 to 30 minutes. I'm not sure how hot it was. It was probably around 105 degrees or something like that. It was getting pretty hot at some points. So yeah, switching over to the sauna. Sauna, many people do also have access to a sauna, whether it's at home or at their gym. Pretty much you can get the same adaptations that you can with the hot water baths. It's just a different format. These hot water baths, you may have to alter the duration and the intensity of the sauna based on, how hot it gets. But if you can increase your core body temperature, that's basically the main mechanism, right? If you're going to get your core body temperature, granted, not many people are measuring their core body temperature, but if you can get to the same core body temperature from using the sauna as you could with a hot bath, then in theory, you should get some of those same adaptations. There's pretty good evidence on the sauna as well, using it after exercise to improve VO2 max. It improves, some of the same cardiovascular adaptations like hot water baths, like muscle capillaries, mitochondria, all those good things. And so my recommendation there would just be, again, try to time it as close as you can to the end of your exercise session. What I prefer to do, sometimes I will go on a run and I'll just end at the gym. It happens to be pretty close to my house. I'll just end my run at the gym, check in, and go directly into that sauna, like before I even stop sweating, basically. Sit in there for 20 or 30 minutes and then get out and walk home. Usually I'm a little bit too tired to run home, so I'll get a bottle of water and walk the few miles home. So I'd like to get in there as soon as I can after I finish a run. If you're not able to do that, just try to keep the time between the sauna and your run as close as possible. And if it's very inconvenient, you can use the sauna on the same day. Maybe if it's not in close proximity to exercise, that's fine too. So that's kind of the protocol that I prefer for that.
How does because I'm a big fan of the traditional saunas when I've got access to them. And even though it can be a struggle, I enjoy them. And I feel this post-sauna buzz or glow. So how do you compare the hot bath experience and then after the hot bath? Is it similar to a sauna or is the sauna more enjoyable?
I don't like it as much. The sauna tends to be a bit more enjoyable. I think there's something relaxing about sitting in the actual sauna. And I just think that just the whole body sweat from the sauna thing just feels good. Like you say, you get that glow afterwards where you just feel good. You can kind of feel good after the hot water bath, but it's a little more, it seems like a little more stressful than the sauna, honestly, when I get out. I'm pretty I think my body temperature might be getting a little bit higher in the hot water bath. But yeah, it just, for me, it just doesn't seem as enjoyable as the sauna. So maybe a subjective thing, but if I had to choose, I would go for sauna every day, any day versus the hot bath.
Yeah. What about infrared sauna blankets? Do you have any experience with these?
I don't actually. And, again, I don't think that there's anything wrong with them, but they're probably not going to be that potent in terms of elevating your body temperature and causing you to sweat. That's going to then lead to these adaptations. I think the allure of them tends to more be the infrared, which I'm a bit skeptical of myself in terms of what it's helping. Maybe some recovery benefits there. I'm sure they get pretty hot, but I've never used one myself. I don't know if you have any experience with those.
Yeah, I got one actually, and I got one thinking it could replicate a sauna, the buzz of a sauna in my house, and unfortunately it doesn't. It doesn't. It gets nice and hot, and it does end up filled with sweat after an hour, but you don't quite get the same extreme heat, and you're always breathing just like room temperature air. So yeah, it doesn't get as hot, and so but there would be some benefit obviously because your body is heating up to some level. It's basically this huge rubber thing that it's a big heavy rubber blanket that you wrap yourself in and close the Velcro. But yeah. Definitely, if I had access to a regular Finnish sauna, I'd be there much more regularly.
Yeah, I think all of this is just about, there are things that can make heat training, passive heat therapy more accessible. The sauna blankets are a great thing because most people can afford it. You can keep it in your house. You don't have to build out extra space in your bedroom or your, bathroom or something for a sauna. So there are just certain levels of it, hot bath. Or you have the sauna blanket, the hot bath, the actual sauna. I mean, I think the key here is that whatever your weapon of choice, I guess, so to speak, you're just going to maybe have to adjust that dose, that intensity to sort of get the adaptations that you want. You can't just do 20 minutes maybe in that infrared blanket and expect the same adaptations as you would 20 minutes in a sauna where you're sweating a lot more. Your body temperature is probably a lot up. But all these things just, I think people need to experiment, see what works, and see what they like the best.
Yeah, it really depends on what you've got available and where you live, and obviously time of year, right? Because in wintertime, I guess the hot baths can be really practical. You get home from a run and you can jump in a hot bath, whereas going to a sauna or getting any other kind of access to these tools might not be so viable. But what about summertime? So I just checked the weather. I think where you are in Austin, is it? I'm looking in Celsius. In Fahrenheit, what's your high today? Is it around 90?
Yeah, I think 90, 93 or 93 to 97 were basically the highs for every single day this week here in Austin. And we tend to also get some crazy humidity as well, especially in the morning. So you're going to have 80 to 90%, maybe even 95% humidity most days in the morning. Tends to get a little bit drier in the afternoon, but lately it's just been very sticky and damp for sure.
I guess you're getting active heat training plus the humidity almost as like a mini sauna effect, right? And then and I guess you can carry that on after your exercise, just walking around in the heat.
I actually tend to use the sauna a lot less here in the summer because, like I mentioned before, it is an additional stimulus. And I mean, if I go and run for an hour and a half in this heat, I mean, you're just like going in the sauna would almost seem a bit counterproductive at that point because I'm just losing. I mean, I think today I ran 10 miles. I even wore a jacket, in the spirit of our discussion. I decided to do some of my own heat training, but I wore a light jacket today. I mean, I think I probably lost 7 or 8 pounds on that run, and I was only out there for an hour. I think it's fun to weigh yourself before and after just to see, and I'll frequently do that, and it's pretty wild how much you can lose on just an hour run. So yeah, I'll continue to do it in the summer. If I do a shorter run maybe, or it's a little bit cooler in the morning, but sometimes you're just you're pretty cooked, figuratively and literally speaking, after a run.
Yeah, no, so the temperature here in Madrid is very similar. I think it's like 93 peak today, but we don't have the humidity. It's like 28 degrees, 20% humidity. But you've inspired me. I think tomorrow I'm going to get out a light windbreaker and maybe wait. Usually try and go running as early as possible when it's hot, but I'll maybe wait until it's a bit hotter and see how it feels. And I'll weigh myself before and after. There you go.
Yeah, that'll be a fun experiment. Yeah, I think, a lot of runners, and of course, if you have a key training session during the week, I would say try to do that when it's cooler because you want to perform well during that training session. But I think, most runners can think about heat in a way use it to your advantage. And I mean, if you're training for a fall race where it's probably going to be cool, use this summer as a way to say, a couple times per week, go in the afternoon. Do, actively engage in heat training by seeking out to run at the hottest time of the day. I think that you don't need to do that every run. You don't want to compromise your training by doing it, and you want to adapt more slowly and carefully to the heat, but embrace the heat and go out in it. I think I attribute my marathon PR last fall to just 3 months of brutal marathon training in this summer heat. On race day, I was in Indianapolis, Indiana. On race day, it was low 50s, no humidity at all. And I mean, even in the week leading up to that race, training in Austin, it was oppressively hot, oppressively humid. And so I just think, training in altitude the week before and then coming down to sea level and running a race, I think that heat really played a role in allowing me to run really well under those conditions, because it was I was basically coming down from altitude, to keep with the theme of what we were chatting about today.
Yeah, I mentioned I used to live in Mumbai for a few years, so there I'm guessing the conditions were pretty similar to Austin, but almost all year round. It was seasonal to some extent, but it was always hot and it's always very humid. So a lot of my training there, if you looked at my Strava, it probably didn't look very impressive. You also did run on the beach quite a lot just to get a clear path. We always had this added resistance that some people might have seen as a handicap, but we kind of knew there was something going on that was helping us when we went to, easier conditions for racing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it can be a handicap in the short term, and sometimes if it's hot enough, it never gets easy, right? I mean, it's all runs are going to suck. There's not just this like point where, oh, well, I can run at 90 degrees now and it feels like it's 70. It's always going to be hot and hard, but your body does adapt a little bit. And then again, I think the benefit of the heat training sometimes isn't about performing better in the heat. It's about, like, what happens when you perform in just temperate conditions when it's not hot. There's one of my favorite, I don't know like the origin of this or who said it, but it's been around a long time and I just always heard it when I was like coming up as a runner. But the idea that heat is the poor man's altitude. I love that phrase. And like after reading the study that we just talked about today, I'm like, well, it literally is true. Heat and / humidity, I think to some extent as well, is the poor man's altitude. So if you don't have to be a poor man, but if you're a time and a resource strapped athlete, as most of us are, who aren't getting paid to do this, embrace the heat.
It's a pretty good proxy
as a stimulus. Yeah, certainly.
And I think it can sometimes take a slight mindset shift if you're used to running a certain pace. But it's something we always talk about when it gets into summer is be aware of the heat. And again, it gets back to what we talked about last time, which is RPE can be one of the best metrics to follow. You're going to slow down when it's super hot outside and when it's humid. So sometimes you've got to put those paces to the side and focus on RPE.
Yeah, use other metrics in the summer. Adjust your expectations.
Cool. Well, Brady, this is a good one. Anything else to add? Have I missed anything?
No, Thomas, I think we covered everything. I think I like a lot of these topics that we've been discussing lately have to deal with heat, which I think is timely for it being the summer. But yeah, I appreciate your insight as always, and this was a fun conversation.
Yeah, I'll let you know how I get on tomorrow. As I say, I've got used to avoiding running in the heat, but after this conversation, I want to go and give it a bash and see what happens.
Yeah, let me know,
lean into it.
Definitely do that experiment of like weighing yourself before and after, especially if you wear that jacket, just because it'll be curious to see. I think you might be surprised if you've never done it. You'll be surprised maybe how much sweat fluid you could actually lose.
Never done it. Never intentionally tried to lose as much fluid as possible over a 1 hour run. So I'll let you know. And we'll link to the study below for anybody that's interested. And there you go.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thanks, Brady.